One thing that strikes me as extraordinarily foolish on the part of the left is going against the Second Amendment. And the reason for this is very simple. And there's an article about this in Gregory Hood's book, Waking Up from the American Dream, that we published at Countercurrents a couple years ago. Basically, his argument is this, and I think he's completely correct. The purpose of having an armed populace is to resist tyranny and make it possible to resist tyranny. However, American gun aficionados will not take up arms to protect the First Amendment or the Third Amendment or the Fourth Amendment or those other amendments. We don't even know what they say, right? They will take up arms only to protect their guns. which means that the guns really don't do any good in protecting the other 9 amendments and any of the other freedoms in America. And if the left would just leave the guns alone, they could chip away at every other freedom without any opposition at all from the gun right. And eventually, once they've basically gotten rid of the First Amendment and all the other amendments, there would be no ability really to I think that they could take away the guns very easily, right? Or they wouldn't even have to. But that's the thing. They by going after the guns, they are actually getting close to provoking an armed insurrection that they could simply avoid. But they're so high on their own supply. They're so arrogant. They're so hysterical. The idea of armed white people out there causes them to schwitz and lose sleep. And that, I think, is a folly on their part. So whenever I hear the left going, all out for gun control, I just think they're not very smart. They're not very smart. They're not very clever. And the gun right will only go, ballistic, literally, if they come for their guns. They'll not fire guns to protect the First Amendment. I don't think that'd happen. But the Second Amendment, they will protect. Guns only will be fired to protect gun ownership, which means it's utterly vacuous. It's a wheel that doesn't turn with the rest of the mechanism. And it can be safely ignored if the left is smart.
I fully agree with your reading. You are extremely insightful in these questions. Now, the problem and I've seen on TV, on CNN, they're talking really about dismantling the Second Amendment. They're talking about getting the guns from the Americans, asking for permits. They're really about to, I don't know the legal state of this, but I've seen discussions that I didn't think would be possible 20 years or 10 years ago. We are talking about a true attack of the left on the Second Amendment rights. And one of the things that I'm most worried about is progressive dismantlement. Because it's like the classic case of a frog that you put either in boiling water or you put the frog in water that you slowly heat. And one of the scary thing with slow dismantlement, for example, over 10 years or 20 years, they might just be adding some laws here and there in some state, adding some permit, and then doing some collection of arms at some places, is it keeps the active resistance from really coordinating because they don't feel concerned until it reaches them. What is your view on the possibility that gun rights may be dismantled so slowly that a coordinated act of resistance might be avoidable for the left?
That is my fear. It's the slow boiling frog idea, or salami tactics. One thing that I'm afraid of is that the states will get involved because we have this antiquated federal system in America. And again, why am I giving advice to the left about how to disarm America? But if they were smart, and they're not smart, they're insane. So I'm in no danger of actually giving them useful information because they'll never take it. So I guess I'll just say it. If they were smart, they'd go about it state by state, and they would chew away or chip away at one form of gun freedom in one state and another form in another state, and they would they would do it that way. And because the main gun rights lobbying organizations are focused on the federal legislature, on federal law, I think that would be a perhaps a very effective way at getting a lot of stuff on the books in place that they could use to eventually, slowly take away gun rights and eventually lay the premises for some kind of national compromise or a repeal of the Second Amendment. And yeah, of course, these things would be litigated, but we know that the court system is very leftist generally in its assumptions. And yeah, it might have to go to the Supreme Court again and again and again, but eventually they'll get the right court, right? And so things like that, I think, would be it's a great danger if they can slowly move in particular states, and if they can avoid having it struck down on Second Amendment grounds by the Supreme Court. Those sorts of things, I think, would and in the process they'd make it de facto difficult for people to maintain their guns, right? So yeah, Americans might have 300 million guns or whatever, but if they slowly start chipping away at spare parts, chipping away at the availability of ammunition and things like that, eventually these things will literally, they'll just rust away and become useless. They should go after gun oil rather than guns, right? And but the left isn't good at playing long games, really. They used to be good at that. I mean, we've gotten in this terrible state because we've had people who are capable of thinking long term and playing long games. But what I'm seeing today is people who are not used to having any opposition, and they're really losing it. They're losing their minds. They're not rational actors. And they don't have brakes, right? They want pedal to the metal all the time, and you can't operate a car without using the brakes occasionally. You're going to hit the wall, and my feeling is that they're hitting the wall. A lot of walls right now are in danger of that because they don't have a governing rationality that would allow them to take things in a slower way. So yeah, they could very slowly chip away at things. I think that their mentality right now is not so careful and patient and pragmatic. I think that if the right is careful, patient, and pragmatic and plays long games, that we can win. And I think Trump actually plays longer games and thinks more moves ahead than the current leftist opposition. And that's something very, very new for the left. They just haven't gotten that from a Republican in any of their lifetimes.
Absolutely. I think that there are certainly strategic thinkers in the anti-gun movement. I'm sure there are. But I think you're right on the mass of the leftists who are anti-guns. Most of them are emotionally triggered probably by guns, and they don't want to know the details. They wouldn't go after the oil because they don't want to hear about how you handle a gun and whether it requires oil or not. So I think your reading is again very insightful. Now on the question of Trump and the long game, I want to come back to this story of Trump who cannot block on Twitter according to a US judge. You asked earlier, and it was really in the interrogative form, I don't think you have a strong position on it, whether Trump is actually playing for the chess here and whether he's getting the left to intentionally getting the left to make decisions that will eventually be at the interest of the right. I do agree that this is going to be a huge thing for people like Jared Taylor at American Renaissance, and that the right needs to care for this story much more than I originally thought after my discussion with Lauren Rose. It will be a very important thing to do to defend our First Amendment right to talk to Donald Trump on Twitter. This is the first step toward a complete publicization and a full access opening of all social networks to everyone, independent of the desires of Zuckerberg and the leaders of all these social media.